Okay, let's do this. So today we're going to talk about somebody very important in American history, and that is a gentleman who served in the Marine Corps for a long time. He retired as a major general. His name is Smedley Butler. Now, this guy is a pretty big figure in the Marine Corps. No hate for Marines here. All the Marines that I ever worked with were cool. They and they were all really smart, like very cerebral dudes. They always want to pretend like they're nothing but you know crayon eaters. But all the Marines that I worked with were like super cerebral thinkers. But anyway, so no hate for Marines here. So Smedley Butler retired as a major general from the Marine Corps. He served in the Marine Corps for more than 3 decades. All right. So why are we going to talk about it? So he wrote a booklet. It's a very small booklet. It's called War is a Racket. Now, the acute observer could probably figure out what this little booklet is about. So this edition here is like 65 or 66 pages, and it's actually more than just War is a Racket. So it's pretty short. It's got an intro, it's got War is a Racket, and it's got some other things as well in this little tiny booklet that you can read pretty much in one sitting. But we're going to talk about why he wrote this, why he felt that war is a racket, and we're going to talk about something called the business plot. You may or may not know, and some of you don't know, that there was an idea that was put forth and it was presented to Smedley Butler in the early 30s that would have involved him potentially leading a coup against the United States when FDR was in the White House. Um, it didn't actually happen. We're going to talk about why it didn't happen. But the short version of the story is because Smedley Butler stopped it. And anyway, but let's talk about that. Okay, so let me just I'm just going to go quickly to the Wikipedia page. Um, I just want to read a couple of sentences about Smedley Butler just by way of a biographical introduction. So he lived from 1881 to 1940. So this is, that's kind of the time period that so just imagine, he didn't even make it to age 60 and he was in the Marine Corps for 30 plus years. Anyway, so during his 34-year military career, he fought in the Philippine American War. Most of us would refer to that as the Spanish American War, the Boxer Rebellion, the Mexican Revolution, World War One, and the Banana Wars. So there was a lot going on at this time period. If you're not familiar with some of those, you can go look them up. Obviously, you're going to know what World War One is, the Mexican Revolution. So that took place, from roughly 1910 to 1920 in Mexico. Clearly, it goes on to say, at the time of his death, Butler was the most decorated Marine in U.S. military history. By the end of his career, Butler had received 16 medals, including 5 for heroism. He's the only Marine to be awarded the Marine Corps Brevet Medal, as well as 2 Medals of Honor, all for separate actions. That is 2 more Medals of Honor than I have. Anyway, so in all seriousness, very highly decorated, was all over the place at kind of an interesting time in our military history, because a lot of people aren't thinking about, if you say the Banana Wars, a lot of people don't even necessarily know what that means. A lot of people wouldn't even necessarily know, well, why would there have been U.S. military involvement that would have had anything to do with the Mexican Revolution. Um, so anyway, yeah, Spanish American War, 1898. So anyway, yeah, a lot going on. So before we look at this, because I'm going to read a couple of passages from this, I do want to just share a very famous quote that comes from Smedley Butler. So if you know anything about Smedley Butler, you may have heard of this quotation. And I'm just going to read it from the Wikipedia page, but it was actually um, first found in a 1935 issue of a magazine that was called Common Sense, which was actually a socialist periodical. You can make what you want of that. But here's what it says. So, a quotation from Smedley Butler. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service. And during that period, I spent most of my time as a high class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. I'm going to pause right there. Okay. This quotation is from 1935. All right. Let me just reiterate that. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico and especially Tampico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National Citibank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. Okay, so that is a fairly well-known quotation from Smedley Butler. And again, that comes from the magazine Common Sense, the November 1935 issue. So again, so that quotation is 90 years old. So War is a Racket. So this little booklet, also published in 1935. Let's see what our man Smedley Butler says here. But as you can tell from that quotation, his mind changed quite a lot, despite having spent what would end up being more than half of his life in the Marine Corps. Okay, so now I'm reading from War is a Racket. And this is how it opens. War is a racket. It always has been. It is possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope. It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of people. Only a small inside group knows what it is about. Only a small inside group knows what it is about. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes. In the World War, this is obviously World War I because this is before World War II. In the World War, a mere handful garnered the profits of the conflict. At least 21,000 new millionaires and billionaires were made in the United States during the World War. Imagine being a billionaire in 1935. How much, like what that would kind of equate to today, right? Skipping down a little bit. How many of these war millionaires shouldered a rifle? How many of them dug a trench? How many of them knew what it meant to go hungry in a rat-infested dugout? How many of them spent sleepless, frightened nights ducking shells and shrapnel and machine gun bullets? How many of them parried the bayonet thrust of an enemy? How many of them were wounded or killed in battle? All right, so I'm going to skip some. For a great many years as a soldier, I had a suspicion that war was a racket. Not until I retired to civil life did I fully recognize it. Skipping more. Okay, take our own case. Actually, let me read up here a little bit. What does it profit the masses? What does it profit the men who are killed? What does it profit the men who are maimed? What does it profit their mothers and sisters, their wives and their sweethearts? What does it profit their children? What does it profit anyone except the very few to whom war means huge profits? Yes, and what does it profit the nation? Take our own case. Until 1898, we didn't own a bit of territory outside the mainland of North America. At that time, our national debt was a little more than $1 billion. Then we became internationally minded. We forgot on shunted aside, or excuse me, we forgot or shunted aside the advice of the father of our country. We forgot Washington's warning about entangling alliances. We went to war. All right, skipping over here. It is dressed into speeches about patriotism, love of country, and we must put our shoulder to the wheel. But the profits jump and leap and skyrocket and are safely pocketed. So, they find a way to sell the war to you, and then, the rich get rich. The rich get richer. All right, skip it over. The bankers collected their profits, but the soldiers pay the biggest part of the bill. If you don't believe this, visit the American cemeteries on the battlefields abroad, or visit any of the veterans' hospitals in the United States. All right, skipping more. In the World War, we used propaganda to make the boys accept conscription. They were made to feel ashamed if they didn't join the army. So vicious was this war propaganda that even God was brought into it. With few exceptions, our clergymen joined in the clamor to kill, 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 to kill the Germans. God is on our side. It is his will that Germans be killed. And in Germany, the good pastors called upon the Germans to kill the Allies to please the same God. This was the war to end wars. This was the war to make the world safe for democracy. All right, so then he says, it's a racket, all right. The only way to smash this racket is to conscript capital and industry and labor before the nation's manhood can be conscripted. 1 month before the government can conscript the young men of the nation, it must conscript capital and industry and labor. Let the officers and the directors and the high-powered executives of our armament factories and our steel companies and our munitions makers and our shipbuilders and our airplane builders and the manufacturers of all the other things that provide profit in wartime, as well as the bankers and the speculators, be conscripted to get $30 a month, the same wage as the lads in the trenches get. So what he's saying here is, all right, how do you break this racket up? And he says, okay, 30 days before you're going to conscript anyone to go fight, conscript all these people that profit from war, so the munitions makers and, anybody in defense industry and the bankers, etc., conscript them to only receive $30 a month, the same wage as the lads in the trenches get. So that's what he means by, conscripting them. All right. So for a month before you conscript anybody to go fight, limit these guys' wages to $30 a month so they at least know what that's like. Let these kings and tycoons and masters of business and all these workers in industry and all our senators and governors and mayors pay half of their monthly $30 wage to their families and pay war risk insurance and buy Liberty bonds. Why shouldn't they? They aren't running any risk of being killed or of having their bodies mangled or their minds shattered. They aren't sleeping in muddy trenches. They aren't hungry. The soldiers are. Then he goes on. Another step necessary in this flight to smash the war racket is a limited plebiscite to determine whether war should be declared. Only those who would be called upon to risk their lives for their country should have the privilege of voting to determine whether the nation should go to war. So you hold a plebiscite to determine whether or not the nation should go to war, and the only people who can vote in it would be those who would be on the hook for actually having to go and fight. A third step in this business of smashing the war racket is to make certain that our military forces are truly forces for defense only. At each session of Congress, the question of further naval appropriations comes up. Now, remember, he's a Marine, so obviously he's would be familiar with that. He goes on to say, the swivel chair admirals of Washington, and there are always a lot of them, are very adroit lobbyists, and they are smart. They don't shout that we need a lot of battleships to war on this nation or that nation. Oh, no. First of all, they let it be known that America is menaced by a great naval power. So what do? Well, they sell to Americans, that there is a risk and that risk must be, well, first, they sell to Congress, but also to the public that there is a risk out there and that we must prepare to meet this, potential adversary. Looking back, Woodrow Wilson was reelected president in 1916 on a platform that he had kept us out of the war. Very true. And on the implied promise that he would keep us out of war, meaning World War I. Yet 5 months later, he asked Congress to declare war on Germany. Yes, that is the great irony. So Wilson had been elected in 1912. Obviously, World War I breaks out in the summer of 1914. The U.S. does not get involved. And when Wilson runs for re-election in 1916, his campaign slogan was, he kept us out of the war, meaning this huge war happened over in Europe and Wilson kept us out of it because most Americans were not wanting to get into it. Then there's the whole issue with the Lusitania that happened in 1915. There's a lot more to that story that you probably need to be aware of. It's not nearly as cut and dried as the mainstream narrative of history would have you believe. We can talk more about that some other day. But anyway, very shortly after Wilson is reelected, what happens? We go to war, and I think the first American troops arrived in Europe, like in the spring of 1917. Okay, what caused our government to change its mind so suddenly? Money. We're back to Smedley Butler here. And then how does he end war as a racket? He says, so I say to hell with war. So that's war as a racket from Smedley Butler. Now, gangsters of capitalism. What does this say? Well, gangster of capitalism is one of the ways in which Smedley Butler described himself in that first quotation that I just read, the one that came from the Common Sense magazine. Yeah, that was kind of a way in which he described himself. But this book is called Gangsters of Capitalism, Smedley Butler, the Marines in the Making and Breaking of American's Empire. And the author there, Jonathan Katz. Okay. So what does it say here? Just from the opening flap. Smedley Butler was the most celebrated warfighter of his time. Best-selling books were written about him. Hollywood adored him. Wherever the flag went, the Fighting Quaker, that was one of his nicknames. He grew up in a Quaker home. The Fighting Quaker went everywhere. Wherever the flag went, the Fighting Quaker went in nearly every major overseas conflict from 1898 until the eve of World War II. From his days as a teenage recruit at the newly seized Guantanamo Bay, he blazed the path for empire, helping annex the Philippines and the land for the Panama Canal, leading troops in China twice, and invading and occupying Nicaragua, Haiti, Mexico, and more. Yet in retirement, Butler turned into a warrior against war and big business. He said, war is a racket, and declared, I was a racketeer for capitalism. Okay, so I'm just going to read just a little bit from the prologue here, because we're going to talk about the business plot. All right, so this idea to supposedly enlist the help of Smedley Butler to lead a coup of basically like disenchanted veterans against FDR. But we're going to talk about this, maybe a little bit more of that story. So Newtown Square, Pennsylvania, 1933. The bankers' men were back. Smedley Butler sized up the one doing all the talking, the bond salesman in the tailored suit. The visitor was sitting in the vaulted main hallway the Butlers used as a living room, his cannonball-shaped head framed by the retired general's old command flags, medals, swords, and assorted tropical bric-a-brac. Two mammoth red satin umbrellas given to Butler by villagers on his last overseas mission to China swayed gently overhead atop their 15-foot poles. The bond salesman, one Gerald C. McGuire, represented himself as a member of the American Legion. a veterans organization founded at the end of the Great War. Many of you are probably familiar with the American Legion. So this guy, Gerald McGuire, a bond salesman, visits Smedley Butler in 1933. He's retired at the time. McGuire was trying to persuade Butler to come to the next Legion convention in Chicago to give a speech denouncing President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, specifically his recent decision to take the dollar off the gold standard. Butler, the salesman said, would travel in secret with a few hundred Legionnaire friends. Once they were at the convention, they would spread out around the assembly and start a chant to demand Butler be given the floor. Okay. You're going to go to the American Legion. We're going to have other people there kind of, you know, at the convention, and they're going to kind of be working together, but people won't necessarily know that. And then all of them will just all of a sudden start chanting to demand that you be given the floor to be able to give some sort of speech at this convention. And that's when you will get up and give a speech in which you denounce Roosevelt. So Butler responds, well, what rank and file veteran could afford a 5-day trip to Chicago in the middle of the Great Depression? This is what Butler's wondering. And McGuire replied, it would all be taken care of, train tickets, hotels, everything. So he's saying, don't worry, there'll be money to get, these veterans to go to this American Legion convention. So okay, anyway, so let's just fast forward here. The dates of the American Legion convention came and went. Butler did not go. But then a few months later, in early 1934, Butler received a postcard from McGuire. It was sent from the French Riviera, where the bond salesman had just arrived after visiting fascist Italy. About 2 months later, Butler received another postcard, this time from Germany. The Reichstag fire had happened a year earlier. Hitler was now chancellor, on his way to becoming Fuhrer. McGuire said he was having a wonderful time in Berlin. All right, so McGuire's going around. He visits Italy. He visits Germany. Anyway, so in August 1934, McGuire called Butler from Philadelphia and asked to meet. So they meet. McGuire says the time has come to get the soldiers together. Okay, so where are we? So they meet. There's this idea for he has pitched this idea to go to an American Legion convention in Chicago. And they're going to kind of conspire to get all these people to demand that he be given the floor to be able to speech. And then in this speech, he will denounce FDR. Butler doesn't go to the convention. So fast forward, and now they're meeting again after he's received a couple of postcards from McGuire. And McGuire's basically trying to convince him again. So Butler's curious about the plan, and we'll find out why. So Butler tries to get McGuire to keep talking, right? So McGuire says the time has come to get the soldiers together. Butler replied, I think so too. But Butler's like really in his head. He's like, what are you talking about? But he wanted to keep the salesman to keep talking. McGuire excitedly recounted all he had seen in Europe, in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. He'd learned that Mussolini and Hitler were able to stay in power because they kept soldiers on their payrolls in various ways. But that setup would not suit us at all. The soldiers of America would not like that, the businessmen opined. So he's like, all right, in Mussolini's Italy or in Hitler's Germany, this can work. They've got military people on their payroll. We can't necessarily do that here in the United States. This is what McGuire is thinking. But in France, McGuire had found just exactly the organization that he thought could work, called the Croix de Feu or Fiery Cross. It was like a more militant version of the American Legion, an association of French World War veterans and paramilitaries organized under the populist authoritarian Colonel Francois de la Roque. Okay, so they find some French organization called the Fiery Cross, and it's like a militant version of the American Legion. And so this guy McGuire says, I think that is an example of something that we could try to have work here in the US. Maguire had attended a meeting of the Croix de Feu in Paris. It was the sort of super organization he believed Americans could get behind, especially with a beloved war hero like Butler at the helm. Okay, so see where we're going? We want this organization of, fiery, disenchanted war veterans led by a charismatic general who is highly decorated and can get these guys to follow. So this is where Butler comes in, right? So Maguire makes his proposal. The Marine, meaning Butler, would lead 500,000 vets in a march on Washington, blending the Croix de Feu's assault on the French legislature with the March on Rome that had put Mussolini's fascisti in power in Italy a decade earlier. So he's taken all these things that happened in Europe and he's trying to figure out how to adapt them to this. So he's like, all right, you're going to get 500,000 veterans and you're going to lead them, and there's going to be a march on Washington. So these 500,000 veterans would be financed and armed by some of the most powerful corporations in America, including DuPont, the nation's biggest manufacturer of explosives and synthetic materials. Many of you are aware that the DuPont, very, very powerful family. The purpose of the coup was to stop Roosevelt's New Deal, the president's program to end the Great Depression, which one of the millionaire DuPont brothers had deemed nothing more or less than a socialistic doctrine called by another name. Butler's veteran army, Maguire explained, would pressure the president to appoint a new Secretary of State or Secretary of General Affairs. Butler, okay? So Butler's going to take 500,000 veterans. They're going to march on Washington, D.C. They're going to pressure Roosevelt to appoint a new Secretary of State or Secretary of General Affairs, which will be Butler, who would take on the executive powers of government. So basically, you're going to appoint Butler to this position, Secretary of General Affairs, and you're going to give him a lot of executive functions. If Roosevelt went along with this, he would be allowed to remain as a figurehead like the King of Italy. Otherwise, he would be forced to resign, placing the new super secretary in the White House. So whether FDR remains in power or whatever, the real man in charge is going to be Butler. Okay, so either FDR is there as a figurehead or FDR is not there at all. But the new executive is going to become Butler. So that's the plot. Smedley Butler knew a coup when he smelled one. He had been in many himself. He had overthrown governments and protected friendly clients around the world on behalf of some of the same U.S. bankers. All right, so we're skipping down here. I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. Butler would write a year later in 1935, the quotation that I already shared. In short, I was a racketeer for capitalism. So this is where Maguire comes straight out and says, about this super organization, would you be interested in heading it? So Butler says, I am interested in it, but I do not know about heading it. Butler. So what he's doing is he's still kind of playing along. But, the author here, so Jonathan Katz says, I am interested in it, but I do not know about heading it, Butler told the bond salesman as he resolved to report everything he had learned to Congress, which would happen. So Butler would go and testify before Congress about this business plot, which is why it never actually, got up off the ground. So basically, he then says, I am greatly interested in it because, Jerry, my one hobby is maintaining a democracy. If you get these 500,000 soldiers advocating anything smelling of fascism, I am going to get 500,000 more and lick the hell out of you, and we will have a real war here at home. So what he's saying is, I'm not going along with this. And if you try to go along with it, I'm going to find 500,000 more people, and then we're going to have problems. Yep. So anyway, and then interestingly enough, so Katz, the author here, goes on to say there were plenty of people when Smedley Butler was in the Marines who actually did not like him. And he mentions Haitians in general, that there's another side of Butler's legacy in Haiti. To Haitians, Butler is no hero. He is remembered by scholars there as the most méchant, which means corrupt or evil, of the Marines. Most notoriously, Butler instigated a system of forced labor in which Haitians were required to build hundreds of miles of roads for no pay and were killed or jailed if they did not comply. Haitians saw it for what it was, a form of slavery. Okay, so anyway, so there's another story to, or there's another side to Butler, which is some of the things he may have been engaged in when he was in the military. But then again, the response to that may be those types of things that he was railing against, once he retired. But anyway, I just share that there just for some wider context. So that's Gangsters of Capitalism. That's as far as we're going to read in that book. And then we're going to sum it up with this book, which we've talked about before. So this is The Unseen Hand. So it's by A. Ralph Epperson, The Unseen Hand, An Introduction to the Conspiratorial View of History. I know I went through this book in the video that I did that was called what was it called? It was about the Geopolitics 101. I think it's something like Say No to Geopolitics 101 or something like that. But I went through this book. So this is a really good book. This is one of the first. So the book is from 85. I read it. I'm going to say probably in 2008. It was one of the first books that I read kind of in my own waking up process. And I read this one. I read The Committee of 300 by John Coleman, which I'm looking at right over there. I read that about the same time. Those were some of the first books that I read. At the same time, I also got the book Tragedy and Hope, which is right back here by Carol Quigley, that 1,200-page monster that I've certainly never read cover to cover, but it is a great reference. But this I have read. Committee of 300 I have read. But there's a part that I want to read here in this book, because this gives us potentially another side that I think is worth exploring. And also because this book may be where I first heard about Smedley Butler. So back in 2008. So I've known about Smedley Butler and the business plot for a long time. But this may be where I first heard about it. Okay, so I am reading on page 269. Again, the book is called The Unseen Hand, An Introduction to the Conspiratorial View of History by A. Ralph Epperson. Okay. All right. It was about this time that an incredible scheme concerning the presidency of the United States started taking shape. From July 1932 through November 1933, a well-known and popular military general, Major General Smedley Butler of the U.S. Marine Corps, was sought by wealthy plotters in the United States to lead a putsch or revolution to overthrow the government and establish an American fascist dictatorship. So I underline all that. I got a big star drawn here, and I wrote, "Wow!" exclamation point. So I mean, I wrote that probably in 2008 when I read it. So I do think that this was the first time that I ever encountered this information. Was back when I would have read this the first time. Butler was tempted into the plot by the biggest bribe ever offered to any American, an opportunity to become the first dictator of the United States. He was approached by three gentlemen: Grayson Mallet, Provost Murphy, a director of Guarantee Trust at J.P. Morgan Bank; Robert S. Clark, a banker who had inherited a large fortune from a founder of the Singer Sewing Machine Company; and John W. Davis, the 1924 Democrat candidate for president and the chief attorney for J.P. Morgan and Company. Now, by the way, the dude mentioned in the other book, Gangster for Capitalism, that we just read about, McGuire. So he worked for, he was basically the spokesman for those guys, the guys that were just mentioned. Their plan was to seize the White House with a private army of 500,000 veterans, hold Franklin Roosevelt prisoner, and get rid of him if he refused to serve as their puppet in a dictatorship they planned to impose and control. The plotters revealed to Butler that they had $3 million in working funds and could get $300 million if it were needed. This is in 1933 dollars. So where are they getting all this money? This is during the Depression. $300 million in 1933 during the Depression. Where are these people getting this money? Why the plotters selected General Butler is a mystery, as Butler truly understood his role as a general in the Marine Corps. He was on record as saying war was largely a matter of money. Bankers lend money to foreign countries, and when they cannot repay, the president sends Marines to get it. Butler didn't say, but his role in the military was exactly in accordance with the balance of power political game described in a previous chapter. Butler's assertions that the military actually acted as a collection agency for the big bankers was confirmed in 1934 by the Senate Munitions Investigating Committee, which confirmed Butler's suspicions that big business, Standard Oil, United Fruit, the Sugar Trust, the big banks, had been behind most of the military interventions he had been ordered to lead. In addition, Congress created the McCormick-Dick Stein Committee to investigate Butler's charges. The conclusion of this group confirmed General Butler's charges, found 5 significant facts that lent validity to Butler's testimony that he had been approached about this, this coup. All right, but this is where it gets super interesting. According to Epperson, there are those, however, who believe that the intent of the plotters was not the imposition of Butler as the leader of the government, but was actually to use the incident as a means by which Roosevelt could impose a dictatorship down upon the American people after Butler led his army upon the White House. This action, after Roosevelt termed it to be a national emergency, could have enabled him to take complete control of the government in the emergency. And the American people would probably have cheered the action. I mean, we know how gullible the American people are. So Butler was, according to this theory, only the excuse to take complete control of the machinery of the government and was never intended to be the new dictator. In other words, he would be a patsy. The plan failed after Butler revealed the existence of the plot. And Roosevelt had to be content, if the theory is correct, with just being the president and not the dictator of the United States. All right. So anyway, this failed. So this business plot failed. So the plan was to move the American government into the area of fascism or government control of the factors of production without a Butler-led revolution. It was decided that one of the main methods of achieving this goal was through a war, and the plans for a war involving the United States were being laid. Okay, and of course, before much longer, we would get World War II. Okay. All right, so what did we learn here? Smedley Butler, he spends, more than 3 decades in the Marine Corps. And after he retires, he begins to rethink his time in service, being a gangster of capitalism, or hired muscle that aided in a lot of the military racketeering that was happening. And he spoke out quite a lot against it. And then he was approached between 1933 and so one of these books says between 32 and 33. The other one says between 33 and 34, but whatever. But around 1933, he is approached by some big businessmen, and he goes along with it to get them to kind of explain their plan in enough detail that he could then go before Congress and basically expose the plot. But there are 2 theories as to what the plot was. So on the one hand, if it was just a straightforward plot, then Butler was going to, through his charisma, being highly decorated, etc., he was going to lead these disaffected, this large group of disaffected veterans, 500,000, on Washington. They would pressure Roosevelt to give him this position of kind of unprecedented executive power. And they were referring to it as either a Secretary of State or a Secretary of General Affairs. But either way, he would become basically the de facto executive, and Roosevelt would remain a figurehead, or they would remove Roosevelt altogether, and then Butler would be in charge, with no figurehead whatsoever. But again, but even if he were the guy in charge, he's doing this at the behest of all these bankers. So who would be the true ruling power? Anyway, but that's all one theory. Those are different variations of one theory, whether or not Roosevelt is still there or not there. But the other theory is that that was not actually the plan, that Butler was just being used as a patsy, and that the plan was just to provide a pretext for then FDR to basically implement some sort of national emergency, and then use emergency powers to do all the things that leaders want to do under the guise of an emergency. So that's Smedley Butler. He didn't go along with it. Maybe, and maybe he realized they were probably going to use him as a patsy. I mean, obviously he didn't want to be a dictator. He didn't want to go along with this coup, but I think maybe he also realized that they were just using him anyway. In any case, he exposed it to Congress, and so the plot failed. Now, these people, they don't back down easily, so they just found other ways to kind of achieve their designs, but the business plot itself failed. So anyway, so that's Smedley Butler. He is a name that more Americans should recognize. This is an important story. People should know it, and I know a lot of Americans do not. But what is the lesson here? The lesson here is, are these people, and because for me, I don't think I don't think it's the big businessmen that ultimately run things. I think they themselves are owned by far more powerful people. But regardless, can we thwart their plans? And the answer is yes. Okay. If you expose them, yes, you can thwart them. Now, are they powerful enough that they will find other ways to achieve their plans? Yeah, they're pretty powerful, and they're much more powerful than they were in 1933 or 1934. Like, that is true. They've consolidated much more power now. But we can expose their plots if we learn them, and if we understand how they operate. We can expose them. We can get more Americans, because what's not going to happen nowadays is exposing this stuff to Congress. That would not happen. But if you expose it before enough of the American people who wake up to what's going on and refuse to go along with it, then yes, we can thwart their plans. And so that is, I think, an important lesson that we should learn. The other thing is that there's no General Smedley Butler today. There's no general who is coming out and saying, "Oh, I can't believe what I was a part of for the last 3+ decades," or I can't believe that this is what's happening, or I can't believe that all the supposed narratives for which we were fighting they were all fabricated. Like, we don't have any generals that have the courage to come out and say that, so, and that's a problem. So anyway, those are just some thoughts on Smedley Butler. And again, just his little booklet here, War is a Racket, and then just detailing some of the unfortunately, failed business plot. So anyway, I hope you got something out of that. Let me know in the comments. Were you aware of who Smedley Butler is? Were you aware of this little booklet, War is a Racket? Had you ever heard of that quotation before that I read? And most importantly, had you ever heard of the business plot? Let me know. All right. Thanks, everyone.